The race analogy was the starting line and the finish line. And I had mentioned to you that if you deal like with the socialist country, and I had kind of used the example of the old Soviet Union versus the United States. The old Soviet Union would basically say, you know what, we cannot control where people start, but we can control where people finish. So everybody should really finish roughly about the same. And I had given you the quote, the idea about private property and about wealth. And basically the idea was that in an ideal society, if you equalize things and you took away private property, everybody would work based upon what they needed rather than in fact trying to get too much. And if everybody had what they needed, then all of a sudden police and government structure would wither away. It would be kind of a utopian thing. Well, the race analogy basically says that socialist countries are going to be putting forward more, if you will, emphasis on the finish line. If you look back at the United States, or maybe a more laissez-faire country, you'd be seeing that they put more emphasis on the starting line and let you go as far as you want to go. Well, the fallacy is that the United States has never been able to establish the same starting line for everybody. And in fact, some of these other countries that focus on the finish line have never actually been able to set a good finish line. So both of these systems are really flawed. It's just the emphasis is on one side or the other, when you could probably argue that the emphasis should be throughout the whole race, you know?
With the U.S. emphasizing like the starting line, what would you characterize as like them emphasizing this? Like what kind of...
The thought is that, you know, you go to public school, you get a certain amount of education, everybody is kind of guaranteed this, but the reality is that schools aren't all the same, and the reality is that some people may run their whole race and never get to the starting line, whereas other people are not only going to be at the starting line, but might even be a little bit further along the starting line too. So just because we say that we're emphasizing the beginning, it doesn't mean that everybody gets the same chance. Do y'all remember what legitimacy was?
Yes, the president who win without earning the whole voters or something.
President who wins.
If you weren't the popular vote.
Yeah.
I think so.
It's probably a little bit broader than that. Legitimacy basically means that you follow the rules.
Yeah.
Legitimacy means that you followed the rules. And the article that I gave you for legitimacy was Ghana. And if you remember in that Ghana article, the one person had won, and I think they ended up winning by like 1/4%. It was like 50.19 or 16 to 49.84, something like that. And basically the idea was that when you're a legitimate leader, it's not that you do a good job when you get into office, but you followed the rules in getting into office. So you were legitimately elected. You didn't cheat. There wasn't any horseplay or violence or things like this. So that's really what we're talking about with legitimacy. Go ahead.
I have a question related to legitimacy. Okay, so this might have been fake news, but I don't know. It seemed pretty crazy that the Democratic election, when Hillary became the Democratic nominee, that there was actually some kind of issue with that. Like she was.
Oh, how Bernie got more votes than the alternate votes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, since we're reviewing, I probably can't talk about that because we haven't, and I'm on real time pressure to get to Rockville. But some people you may have heard came out, and with all of the Russia stuff with Trump, which we did talk about a little bit in class, they actually came out and said that Trump was not a legitimate president because of some of those shenanigans. And to be honest with you, the Democrats and the Republicans do these kinds of things all the time. To say that somebody is not legitimate is really an awful thing to say in a democracy. I mean, let's be honest, whether you're talking about Hillary or Trump or whomever it would be. But legitimacy is the idea that you followed the rules and you ultimately got elected. You could fall completely flat on your face, but you were legitimately elected. And a dictator could come in and take over and overthrow the system and do wonderful things, but they're not legitimate because they didn't follow the rules to get there. So it's not what you do when you're in office, but it's how you got there. Yes?
For the article you gave us on Ghana,
Yes.
I think the differences of the two candidates was very small number, and I remember you asked that was me,
Would you challenge it?
would
Yeah.
challenge it. So if I challenge it and you refuse as a candidate who won those small points, then will you be a legitimate wilderness leader or something?
That's a really good question, and that's probably dependent upon who you ask. So I'll make sure that I do not ask that on the exam, since there's not really a clear answer. Because, like I said, I mean, people are criticizing Hillary that y'all just mentioned. I mentioned in class that people are criticizing Trump. I mean, it's one of those things that really, it's in the eye of the beholder. But I promise I will not ask that. I promise I will not ask that. Go ahead.
How would you relate that article with the
The thing about the article was that both sides basically acknowledged that the vote count was the vote count. One side conceded, the other side recognized the concession, and then they went forward. And I think I had mentioned in class that it would be really hard to get that close and to not challenge at that point, but they basically followed the rules. There wasn't violence or anything. And I think that article, it said something in there about legitimacy, and it was talking about this idea of the transfer of power. And I'll go ahead and pull this up really quick, because this actually is a really nice quote. And bear with me as I pull this up. It says up here, and this is in that second column, John Peter Pham, an Africa expert at JMU in Virginia, said the election was the first case in Africa I can think of where a country has seen two successive transfers of power from democratically elected incumbents to democratically elected successors. So in other words, Party A is in power, but then Party B wins the election and they transfer power. Party B then runs as the majority party, and then Party C wins, and then they transfer the power. So it's actually very, very rare. At least in Africa. And it even says it at the very beginning. Ghana is now one of the few African countries to successfully transfer power twice from one legitimately elected leader to another, meaning the sitting person won. It's easy to have elections when the winner wins again, but when the other side wins, does the winner give up? Well, that's what happened in Ghana several times, and it doesn't happen a lot in a lot of democratic countries. So that's what I'd be looking for, and we didn't spend a lot of time on the Ghana article. Unitary system and federal system, just really quick. If you remember, federal system, there's multiple levels. Unitary system is basically you've got one big government that's running things, and I think, Laura, you mentioned France in class today. France is a pretty good example with the way that they do their education. I think this was the chapter where it mentioned in there in France that in fact the education minister could look at his or her watch and they would know exactly what verb in Latin was being translated on that day in every classroom in France. And that's not exactly the way it is in federal systems, because you've got a national government, you've got state government, you've got local government, and everybody is kind of doing things, so it's a lot harder to predict.
And any federal laws about education, that only started with Bush, I think, I'm not sure.
I think there were federal laws dealing with education before Bush,
It was the No Child Left Behind policy.
but
That's
that would have been more of Bush, that more specific piece. Notice up here you got plurality versus majority, and y'all know what a plurality is, right?
Yeah.
Plurality is when you get the most votes, but it's not more than half. Of course, majority is when you get more than half. And do y'all remember what we had talked about with this idea of proportional representation?
It's just like like say for example, there's 30% of one group and they get 30% of the vote, like parliamentary system.
Yeah, and you'll notice in here, and this is actually from page 71. It says, if the district is entitled to 10 seats, each party offers voters a party list of 10 candidates. Each voter picks one list, and then the party gets seats in proportion to the vote it receives. If the party won 30% of the votes in a 10-member district, it would get the first 3 names on its party list parliament. A party with 20% would send its first 2 names, and you get so on down the line. And if you remember when we were talking about this idea of the proportional representation versus the single-member district, I had mentioned to you that single-member district is really good at getting a majority of seats so that it's easier to govern, but a lot of the votes get ignored. Because just because you won a district, you vote for a person, you won the district, that means that everybody that didn't vote for you technically doesn't get a voice. Well, in a proportional system, people get the voice, but in a proportional system, it's much, much harder to govern because there's not one clear majority.
There's a bunch of different voices.
A bunch of different voices, exactly. So that's what we had talked about with those. I know we talked about, and just kind of jumping into ideology really quick, I know we had talked about feminism and some things like this. Pay good attention to the